Here's the story of two related questions. Why did Edgar Allan Poe write so many stories about murder? And what is the origin point of American literature? They have the same answer, and it's a murder case involving a man named James Yates. His murder was so hideous, so disturbing, so confusing to anybody who thought they understood human nature that it prompted a novelist named Charles Brockden Brown to create a novel called Wayland, and that's regarded as the first distinctively American great novel. And that novel prompted Edgar Allan Poe to think, oh, you so got it wrong, Mr. Brown. And Poe then wrote some of his most famous stories in response to that novel. And he wrote, according to my count, 8 stories specifically about the psychology of murder. Let's start with James Yates. He was a member of a religious sect called the Shakers. They were ecstatic in their Christianity. They were the sorts of people who danced in church and spoke in tongues. One evening in the winter, Yates and his family and neighbors had an especially moving church service at his house, and he was very happy. He was moved by the religious experience. And after they put the children to bed, he sat with his wife, and they indulged in their favorite pastime of reading Bible verses to each other. And that's when James Yates realized that even earthly pleasures like having a family and loving a child were a distraction from his love for God. He hurled his Bible into the fire. His wife asked him why he would do such a thing, and she dragged the Bible out of the fire. He threw it back in, and then he went to work, getting rid of everything that distracted him from God. He killed their 2 sons, and he next attempted to kill the baby, but he found his wife had run out of the house and was running for help with the baby in her arms. She was running toward her own parents' house, which was only a short distance away. He followed after her and took the baby from her and dashed its life out. He was later confused by the strange circuitous route that his wife took as she ran away. He thought, why in the world would she have curved away from her parents' house at the last minute? Surely what was in her mind was to save her own parents' lives, to give up herself in sacrifice for their lives. In any event, he killed his wife, and he bludgeoned her until her face was not recognizable. That only left one member of his immediate family, which was his 11-year-old daughter, and he searched all over for her, calling for her, and he finally found her in the barn, where her shivering gave her away because it caused a noise in the corn husks. He called her out. She begged for her life. She said she'd do a great job helping him and his wife with her baby sibling, and of course she didn't know yet that he had murdered everyone. Well, Yates was moved because he loved his daughter, and so he said, maybe you're right, Rebecca, and he asked her to dance in the holy way that they knew from their church. And so she danced to save her life. It wasn't enough, and he killed her with an axe through her skull. He was just about done. He was running out of energy. And next he knew that he needed some sort of help. So he headed for his sister's house. She lived nearby. Sometime in this carnage, he also attacked the horses in his barn, badly injured them. Well, he arrived at his sister's house and knocked on the door. She opened it, and she was very surprised because, first of all, there was her brother standing in the snow naked, and second, because he was covered in blood. She told him, for God's sakes, to come in and get out of the cold. He came in, and he reached for a knife that he saw on a dresser. But his sister, not knowing anything that had happened, simply thought he was involved in some sort of nonsense. She took the knife away from him, but she must have been scared because she realized something was too dangerous about him. So she tied him up, and then she went to investigate. And she found these horrors awaiting her. But she heard someone weeping, and that gave her a hope that at least someone had survived. But when she finally found this person weeping, it was an old man. In fact, it was Yates's father-in-law, the man who his wife might have sought out for help, except that she thought to save his own life. And he had come along in the morning to visit his daughter, and he found her body that he could only recognize by the clothing because her face had been bludgeoned off. That's the story of James Yates. He was sent to prison for the rest of his life. He escaped twice and was recaptured both times. One time he escaped by using some kind of a caustic substance to erode the bars of his cell. The whole rest of his life, he felt that he had done the right thing because he had honored God at the sacrifice of his family. The only thing that he thought he had sinned in was in trying to burn the Bible. That's the story of James Yates. And Charles Brockden Brown soon wrote a Gothic novel about it called Wayland. And it addresses the obvious question, which is, why in the world would somebody do something like that? Now, Yeats had actually explained why he did it. The reason that he did it was that voices told him to. He had heard two voices during his murder spree, and one of them urged him to kill everyone, to put God first, and to kill everyone else. And the other voice said to him exactly what we're probably thinking, which is, why in the world would you hurt your loved ones? Please don't do this. But he listened to the first voice. Where could these voices come from? Well, in Charles Brockden Brown's novel, and by the way, there are going to be spoilers throughout this video, but in Charles Brockden Brown's in his novel, he hasn't made the video yet, in his novel, he had kind of a plotty explanation, which was there was a ventriloquist involved, and it was providing some voice that told his fictionalized version of Yates what to do. And Brown did go deeper than that and tried to inquire into who would be responsible in the case of such a murder, and he decided that someone who was too credulous about religion was responsible for whatever he did, whether it was the victim of a ventriloquist or just somebody who had let his religion get a hold of him. As you can imagine, this is not a real satisfying solution in the novel. The ventriloquism kind of ruins it. Now, back in those days, that was the early days of ventriloquism as entertainment, and it came out of a long tradition of ventriloquism used, for example, in Greek temples, where priestesses would claim that they were channeling the gods, and people believed it. So it probably doesn't seem as stupid 200 years ago to think of ventriloquism as some kind of an answer in this hideous murder. But there were those who were dissatisfied, and one of them was Edgar Allan Poe. Now, he came along more than 60 years after the murder, and about 40 years after Charles Brockden Brown's novel, but he was in a generation of writers who had heard all kinds of praise for this novel and for its psychology and its parsing of the morals of this case. People like Mary Shelley were great fans of Charles Brockden Brown's work and had praised it. Her father, William Godwin, another person who had used the Gothic novels as a way of inquiring into morality and ethics. They all thought that Brown was great, and Poe read it and he didn't think it was so great. So he responded not just by argument, but by fiction. But he put in his own art, his own struggles with the idea of why somebody would do such a hideous thing. So, as I said, he wrote 8 stories, and he wrote them basically from 1841 to 1849, which is when he died. So, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that once he kind of got a hold of this question, it obsessed him for the rest of his life. And some of these stories that he wrote are among his best. They're famous ones that you will have heard of, and others you will not have heard of unless you really delved into Poe. But let me tell you about them, and again, there will be spoilers. The first is the famous Murders in the Rue Morgue, and this is the story of basically a mysterious locked room murder. How did this murder happen to these two women in a locked room, and why did it happen? Well, in the story, there's money laid out, but it's not been stolen. There was a visit from a bank clerk to deliver the money, so the bank clerk is arrested, but he didn't really have any motive to do it. And the murders are atrocious. One of the women is nearly decapitated with a straight razor. So, what's the answer here? Well, Poe delved into this question of voices, and he made it part of the mystery. Um, James Yates had heard voices telling him to do this, or so he claimed. And in Poe's story, all the witnesses have heard voices. They've all heard the same voices. They agree on the general sound of them, but they disagree on what language was being spoken. And so Poe goes through a lot of clues about a guy who spoke this language, thought he heard the murderers speaking a different language. And it turns out that nobody who heard the voices actually spoke the language that he thought it was. He associated this murderous language with some other country that he wasn't familiar with. The answer, if you read the story, turns out that it was an orangutan, and he was jabbering at this sailor who was his owner. He was just basically an exotic pet that had escaped and gone on a rampage. Well, Poe's asking with this story about the limits of humanity, and he goes to great lengths to show how the orangutan um, imitates human behavior. For example, it's imitating the shaving of his owner when suddenly he's caught at it and he runs away with the razor blade at hand. He jabbers, and it seems to be an imitation of human speech, but not any actual meaningful human speech. When he slits throats, it's because he's imitating shaving. He doesn't actually mean any harm. When he hides one of the bodies up a chimney, it's because his owner is griping at him and telling him he's got to stop. So he realizes he's done something wrong in some primitive, dog-like way and tries to cover it up. So you're invited to ask, why would a human being do this? And the mystery that's revealed, or the answer to the mystery that's revealed, is that it wasn't a human being, it was an animal. But then Poe really smudges that answer and makes it much more uncomfortable by showing how similar the animal really is to human beings. So that's Murders in the Rue Morgue. He followed it up with some of the same characters, the detective and his kind of proto-Watson character, in a story called Marie Roget, The Mystery of Marie Roget. And this is an interesting experiment because it's about an ongoing murder case in his own time, and he's very lightly fictionalized it and given French names to these American characters. Mary Rogers becomes Marie Roget. And it's not an interesting story, it's just an interesting premise for a story. And one reason it doesn't work is that the murder wasn't solved at the time he was writing, and when it was solved, or when it came to an end anyway, it sort of made his speculations not very interesting. But it was an attempt at it, and it was kind of an attempt at the sort of Blair Witch Project story, this story that's disguised to look like a true case. So there's a minor kind of a failure in my opinion. But then the next story is The Telltale Heart, which is one of the greats. And the great innovation there is to tell the story from the point of view of the killer, who doesn't even understand his own motives. He's kind of in the position of Yates, except that he has no good excuse. he even ponders that mystery. He says, I loved the old man, so why did I do it? And he says that it has something to do with the old man's eye that haunted him. It's a very acute psychological study, and the man's guilt, his love for this person that he actually ends up murdering, uh, the love is separate from the murderous feelings. He's a very divided person. He's a schizophrenic in the original sense of being a fractured personality. So it's a very acute observation, and it's very similar, I think, to the real James Yates, who still loved his family even while he was killing them, and heard voices telling him both to do it and not to do it. The next in Poe's series, and all of these are coming within, these first few are coming within 3 years. The next is The Black Cat. And The Black Cat is a great story, and when I was young, I remember sort of thinking it was like The Telltale Heart, but not as good. And the older I get, the more I think The Black Cat might be just as good as The Telltale Heart. It's a very realistic story, and that, for me as a youngster, was kind of part of what ruined the fun. As opposed to a horror story where there's a crazy killer doing cool stuff, this is a crazy killer doing realistic stuff. He's a guy with a drinking problem. He's a guy who has a happy marriage until his drinking gets out of hand. He's a guy who loves animals until his drinking gets out of hand. And then the violence happens. And there's a story of, a wife who stands by him even while he abuses her. It's a grungy story. It's very about living in poverty and living in addiction. The murder in this story happens sort of as an accident. The guy's trying to murder the cat, or trying to kill the cat, and he murders his wife with an axe by accident. But that murder with an axe very much is a callback to the Yates case that would have still been known in his time. It's very disturbing, and then of course the ending is that a voice gives it away. Just as in Yates's case, voices matter. In this case, it's the cat making a noise from behind the wall where the murderer has bricked up his dead wife. Okay, now the next one is one that you won't have heard of unless you're deep into the Poe, and it's Thou Art the Man. This is a very strange story because it has a lot of comedy in it. And it's sort of a detective story. Poe is credited with inventing the detective story in that earlier piece, Murders in the Rue Morgue. And by the time he wrote this one, which is 1844, so that's 3 years later, the detective idea, or at least the mystery idea, was so common that he sort of parodies it in this story, and makes a little fun of it. He mentions people like Dickens who were writing this sort of murder story. And this one is a preposterous, far-fetched mystery. He starts off by making fun of how anytime somebody's named Charlie, they're an open-hearted, good fellow, and that's why everybody with that kind of character on the stage is called Charlie. And of course, Charlie, very quickly, he realizes the murderer in this case. The resolution here is the odd part. Our detective sort of pulls a practical joke to reveal the murderer. He digs up the corpse of the dead man, or pulls him out of the well where he deduces he's been thrown. And into this rotting corpse, he inserts a big piece of whalebone so that it will spring upright when it's unboxed. And then he boxes it up, disguised as a shipment of wine. And when our bad guy, when the killer opens this box, the corpse springs up, and then with ventriloquism, like right out of Charles Brockden Brown, the detective accuses the murderer and basically causes him to drop dead of fright and guilt and horror. There's another comedy attempt in his next murder story, The Imp of the Perverse. This is a story that sort of has a lot of fun with the guy's insanity. He gets phrases stuck in his head that he can't get out. Um, and it's sort of an inversion of the Telltale Heart, where we hear the story from the killer's lips, but I think it makes a much worse decision about it, in that we don't figure out he's a crazy killer until far into the story. So, a different strategy than the Telltale Heart, and not nearly as effective, but kind of an interesting story. This idea of the imp of the perverse was one that Poe used again and again. And the idea was that we all have these perverse desires in us that are contrary to our own best interests, or even contrary to our own desires. So, just like James Yates had this perverse desire to murder people, even while he also knew that he loved his family and wanted to save them, um, that's what goes on in this story, too. It's a minor piece of Poe, and I won't recommend it unless you're a completist with Poe. The next one, though, is a very famous one, The Cask of Amontillado, Amontillado being a kind of wine. And this is a revenge story, and it involves a man tricking his enemy into going deep into the catacombs, where he chains him up and builds a wall in front of him, just like in The Black Cat. And the man, of course, dies there and is undiscovered for decades, until the narrator, the murderer, tells us this story. He seems to be telling the story, at least in my guess, as his deathbed confession of what happened to his enemy. The thing is that the guy really wasn't an enemy. He was kind of a rival connoisseur of wine and sort of a friend. And so the victim didn't know he was an enemy. There was some little slight that our narrator took horrible offense at, and then took revenge for. And for his revenge to be complete, he felt like he needed to not be caught at it. So he never told until this deathbed confession. And so the horror here is that people around you can be harboring these psychotic grudges without ever speaking up about them. They can be acting on things. They can be murdering people for no good reason. There's a hint here that this is something that happens in Italy, and is not something that would happen in a civilized place. And then there's a final horror story by Poe from 1849, about 7 months before he died, and it's called Hop Frog. And strangely enough, it returns to the idea of orangutans for murder. It also returns yet again to the idea of the human voice and whether that really marks humanity itself. In this story, there's a court jester whose name is Hop Frog because his people abuse him and call him by this terrible name until it becomes his name. And he's a ventriloquist, and he can make hideous animal-like noises. He's compared to a parrot. But he's not the villain here, he's the hero. And when the king and his court of pampered rich guys not only insult Hop Frog's girlfriend, but also strike her, this is when Hop Frog uses his wits to gain revenge. And it involves a costume ball where he convinces the king and his court of ministers and so forth to dress up as orangutans, but he makes sure that the costumes are flammable. And once he's sort of reduced these men to the beasts that they really are, that's when he can commit a horrible violence upon them and then escape. Okay, those are the 8 murder stories of Poe. There are other murders in Poe, for example, in his novel, Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, but these are the pieces where I feel like there's a thematic unity as he wrestles with this question of why human beings commit murder, whether it's a sign that we really are animal in our nature. Where does the human being end and the higher soul begin, if there is such a thing? And how do you know whether the higher soul might be leading you into the darkest deeds that a human being can do? Thanks for listening.